Pope Francis has left behind a surprising fortune. Yes, you heard that correctly. The same Pope known for driving a modest Ford Focus, living in a Vatican guest house, and refusing a papal salary has stunned the world posthumously. Typically, individuals who work and reside at the Vatican or in Rome earn monthly salaries of around €4,000 to €5,000. But when his family discovered what he had left behind, it moved them to tears. Jesse Waters is covering the story of a sealed last will and testament that's causing a stir within the Vatican and prompting one major question: how did someone who seemingly owns so little leave behind something so significant? At one point, visitors to the Vatican had come to present the Pope with a certificate making him an honorary member of their group of Sant'Ageno blood donor volunteers. But what was inside the envelope he left behind wasn't just about money, it was something far more meaningful. From his very first appearance on the Vatican balcony in 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis, made his untraditional approach clear. He abandoned the ornate red shoes and the Grand Apostolic Palace, opting instead for a simple room in the Domus Sancti Marthi guest house. There, he welcomed guests with warmth, humility, and, if you were fortunate, a humble meal. To many, Pope Francis was a pope of the people, grounded, approachable, and unpretentious. He refused the standard papal salary, which was estimated at around $32,000 per month, stating he had no use for such wealth. He rejected the idea of being separated from others by status, riches, or comfort. In interviews, he would deflect questions about retirement perks, personal security, or material possessions. The shepherd must smell like the sheep, he once remarked, a principle that guided his every action, from his ministry to the poor to his choice to walk Vatican halls without an entourage. His modesty extended even to transportation. Instead of the typical black Mercedes or official limousines, Francis often traveled in a weathered Ford Focus. He once blessed a group of 35,000 Harley-Davidson bikers in St. Peter's Square, then gave away the motorcycle he received as a gift. He sold a luxury car for charity and urged bishops to avoid indulgent vehicles. Observers around the world got the message: Pope Francis had no desire for personal wealth, not even when it was offered in gold-embossed envelopes. So when discussions arose about the Vatican's immense institutional wealth, estimated between 10 and 15 billion euros, very few connected any of that to Francis personally. He didn't reside in a palace, eat lavish meals, or entertain renovations for grandeur. He was often seen spending time with janitors rather than high-ranking dignitaries. Quiet moments of prayer, nighttime visits to the homeless, and time spent with society's forgotten were part of his daily routine. Public records supported this image: no personal estate, no known bank accounts, no family trust, and no signs of any intention to accumulate wealth. Vatican insiders would often say, if Pope Francis left anything, it's probably just a few books and a well-worn Bible. But as time passed, things didn't appear quite so simple. Despite his public rejection of materialism, there were murmurs, barely perceptible, about how his unused salary was managed. No one questioned it at the time. This was the Vatican, after all, a place of mystery and tradition. But now, after his passing, those whispers are being reevaluated. Was his renunciation of wealth truly absolute, or was there a deeper layer to his decisions? If he really had nothing, why did an envelope cause a woman in Argentina to break down in uncontrollable tears? Before answering that, it helps to understand how his daily life was structured behind the scenes. Although Pope Francis rejected personal wealth, he deeply cared for those who had stood by him long before he wore white robes or held global influence. Some of those individuals, it seems, were never forgotten. Quietly and without fanfare, Francis may have been setting something aside, not for himself, but for someone he valued more than gold. And that could change everything. It's a mistake to assume that refusing a salary means the money disappears. The Vatican doesn't operate that way. When Francis declined his monthly stipend, the funds didn't vanish. According to those familiar with Vatican financial operations, there are protocols for such situations. When a pope turns down his salary, the money is quietly redirected, sometimes to charities, other times to specific foundations, and occasionally into accounts authorized for future discretionary use. During one visit, Francis was again honored by the same group of blood donor volunteers, reinforcing his close ties with those who served quietly. Officially, he never accepted a salary. But behind closed doors, the Vatican continued to allocate the budgeted funds. Like other Vatican employees, whose monthly earnings typically range from €4,000 to €5,000, a portion of that money over time was reportedly funneled into a trust under Francis's name, not for his own benefit, but for causes he deemed important. These funds were managed discreetly and without any public disclosure. It seems contradictory, a man who preaches humility and poverty yet retains legal authority over a six-figure annual sum. But Francis was never about appearances, he was about purpose. And purpose can often go unnoticed. While most popes before him used their stipends for travel, gifts, personal needs, or even retirement planning, Francis redirected most of his allocated funds into social programs, particularly those rooted in Argentina, his homeland and emotional anchor. He served the world as pope, but he never forgot Argentina, where he had spent over 60 years. He supported orphanages, medical clinics for impoverished families, and scholarships for young seminarians from struggling regions. Some of these acts were publicized, most were not. Interestingly, he never established a personal foundation or named any institution after himself, a departure from many religious or public figures today. Instead, he is now believed to have worked through intermediaries, two of whom are reportedly connected to Jesuit financial circles in Latin America, who helped manage and grow a trust over time. So why all the secrecy? According to some Vatican insiders, it was his way of honoring his vow of poverty while still making provisions for those who mattered. To the public, he was the pope who lived in a guest house, but privately he may have been managing the only form of inheritance he could justify, one built entirely for others. Still, few suspected that the money had ever been earmarked for family. Pope Francis rarely spoke about his relatives, and when he did, it was with reserved affection. He once mentioned his sister Maria Elena in passing during an interview, calling her the one person who remembers who I was before all this. That statement didn't turn heads then. It does now because Maria Elena, living quietly in Argentina, had never accepted any benefit from her brother's position. She lived modestly, even when her health began to fail. She was never spotted at Vatican events, never featured in international media, and never sought out attention. But sources now say that Francis kept in contact with her regularly and even wrote to her weekly, not just letters of love, but of reassurance, perhaps to prepare her for something he knew she'd one day receive. That something, it turns out, was already growing. Year after year, as the public marveled at the Pope's humility, the trust remained untouched. Reports say it was invested conservatively. No risky portfolios, no extravagant gains, just steady, quiet accumulation. Until, after more than a decade, it had grown into something substantial, more than just a symbolic gesture. Now, with Pope Francis gone, those quiet financial habits are beginning to surface. And they don't look like the actions of a man with no plan. They look more like a farewell gift in the making. And it would only take one envelope to unlock it. His sister, his anchor, Maria Elena Bergoglio, never saw herself as the sister of a pope. To her, Jorge was simply her older brother, the one who'd walk her to school, defend her from neighborhood bullies, and later, after their father died, fill the role of a second parent without ever saying it out loud. Their bond was forged long before the white cassock and the papal ring, rooted in the quiet routines of Buenos Aires in a house that echoed more with prayer than with wealth. When Jorge became Pope Francis in 2013, Maria Elena didn't fly to Rome for the inauguration. It wasn't because she didn't want to. It was because he asked her not to. According to her, he said the money it would take to travel should be spent on people in need. Pray from home, he told her. That's more than enough. And she did, every day. They never lost touch. Even as the demands of the papacy pulled him into global affairs, through handwritten letters, short phone calls, and the occasional recorded message, the siblings stayed connected. He never signed his letters Pope Francis. Always just H. And he'd often end with a phrase she grew to treasure, Cuidate, Hermanita. Take care, little sister. Her life in Argentina remained low-key, no cameras outside her home, no exclusive interviews. The media occasionally tried to find her, but she never gave them much to work with. A quiet woman with a quiet life. She raised her family modestly, worked when she was able, and battled through her own health crises, including a stroke that nearly took her voice. Through all of it, he was there, not in person, but in prayer and often on the other end of the phone. There's a certain kind of loyalty that doesn't make headlines. Maria Elena embodied it. She never asked her brother for favors, never once tried to capitalize on his position. She even refused invitations to Vatican functions out of principle, insisting she didn't want to distract him or give the impression that she was enjoying privileges others couldn't. But Francis never forgot her sacrifices, and he certainly never forgot that she was the last living member of his immediate family. He carried that knowledge quietly, just as he carried his own burdens. And in his final years, particularly after several health scares, those close to him noticed a subtle shift. He started asking more questions about legal matters, about trusts, about how to ensure things were carried out quietly but with purpose. He never said her name publicly in these conversations, but there was no doubt who he was thinking of. And when his health sharply declined in early 2025, Vatican aides confirmed that one of his last personal requests involved sending a document to Argentina via secure courier to a woman who had never once stepped inside the apostolic palace. That woman, of course, was Maria Elena. When the sealed envelope arrived, she didn't open it right away. According to neighbors, she held it in her hands for a long time, pressing it against her chest like it was a final embrace. No one knew what was inside. Not yet. But what was clear even then was that the bond between them had endured everything: the church, the fame, the distance, and even death. She wasn't just the sister of the Pope. She was the one person who never let him forget who he was before the world called him Holy Father. And now she was about to discover what he had quietly left behind. The envelope arrives. The world was still catching its breath. Pope Francis had passed, and with his death came solemn rituals, public mourning, and the quiet sealing of Vatican doors. The papal apartments were closed. The bells had tolled. Flags hung at half-mast across the world's most powerful churches. A major moment for the 1.3 billion Catholics around the world. Pope Francis has passed away. But in Argentina, the mourning was quieter, personal. Maria Elena, his sister, had not flown to Rome. Her health wouldn't allow it. Instead, she stayed home, surrounded by silence, until a man in a dark suit rang her doorbell with an envelope in hand. He said nothing, only nodded and left. It looked like nothing more than a thick, cream-colored document sealed with a red wax crest. No royal fanfare, no headlines. But this envelope would soon spark one of the most unexpected twists in the legacy of the humble Pope. While Maria Elena held the envelope nearly 7,000 miles away, a different kind of reveal was unfolding on American television. Jesse Waters appeared on air, seated at his studio desk with a stack of papers in front of him and that trademark smirk that always seemed to signal something big was coming. His opening line was direct: "We've got the Pope's last will and testament." And let's just say it's not what anyone expected. Pope Francis leaves behind a fortune that makes his family cry. At first, viewers assumed this would be a theological segment, maybe a final message, a quote, something spiritual. But what followed felt more like something out of a courtroom drama. Waters unfolded the document and tapped a line with emphasis. "This," he said, "is a legal acknowledgement of a trust fund managed for over a decade with explicit instructions for disbursement to one individual, Maria Elena Bergoglio." On the screen behind him appeared a breakdown, nothing too detailed but enough to cause a stir. A Vatican-managed fund, annual deposits, accrued interest, a figure undisclosed officially but speculated to be in the high six, possibly low seven-figure range, earmarked for one woman, and more importantly, for a cause. Waters leaned in. According to sources familiar with the trust, Pope Francis spent years quietly diverting unused papal stipends, royalties from his written works, and private donations into this account. Not for himself, not for luxury, but for the sister he never stopped writing to, and for the people she continues to live among. The reaction was instant. Across social media, people were confused, intrigued, and in many cases, deeply moved. Why would a man who lived in near poverty leave behind a small fortune? One user asked. Because he wasn't storing treasure for himself, another replied. He was planting it for someone else. Meanwhile, in Buenos Aires, Maria Elena finally opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in her brother's unmistakable handwriting. It didn't begin with ceremony. It simply said, "Herman Menita, little sister." In the letter, he thanked her for her silence, her strength, and her sacrifices. He wrote about their parents, their childhood, and how he never stopped thinking about the time she offered him her only coat during a winter storm when they were both teenagers. "You gave me warmth," he wrote. "So now I return it." Attached to the letter were official documents confirming the transfer of the trust, not just to her, but to a joint board she would chair alongside local Argentine clergy to use the funds for healthcare and housing initiatives in their neighborhood. "This is not wealth," he wrote. "It is simply love in a different form." She wept, not because of the money, but because it was exactly what he would do. Jesse Waters closed his segment with a line that caught even his critics off guard. "Maybe the Pope didn't take his salary, but it looks like he found a way to turn silence into something loud, something that made his family cry for all the right reasons." And the story wasn't over yet. Not even close. Reactions from around the world followed. The reaction was a strange mix of awe, confusion, admiration, and in some corners, suspicion. How could a pope who refused luxury, rejected salary, and made humility his personal brand leave behind a trust fund big enough to build a hospital wing? The Vatican issued a short but firm statement. Pope Francis managed his personal stipends and royalties in accordance with canon law. All disbursements were approved through the proper internal channels. But that didn't stop the speculation. News outlets scrambled for more details. European papers ran headlines like "Francis's final gift" and "the hidden fund of the people's pope." In Buenos Aires, local stations camped outside Maria Elena's home. She didn't speak to cameras, but neighbors did. One woman who had known her for decades said, "She always said she needed nothing from him. She just prayed for his safety. And now, he's given her everything." Online, the story went viral, not because of the amount of money involved, but because of who had given it. People weren't used to seeing a spiritual leader handle finances in a way that actually aligned with his values. He didn't spend it on art, cars, or estates. One commenter wrote, "He gave it to someone who would make sure it stayed where his heart always was." Of course, not everyone reacted with such warmth. A few critics questioned the optics. One Vatican watcher asked, if this trust existed, why was it never made public? Why keep it hidden? Skeptics suggested it raised concerns about transparency, especially in a church that has long struggled with financial scandals. But even they had to admit, it didn't look like Francis benefited from any of it. If anything, it looked like he had intentionally removed himself from the equation. Others focused on the letter, now partially released by the family at the urging of a local archdiocese. In it, Francis wrote plainly, "To serve the church is to serve those who wait in silence." Maria Elena waited in silence her whole life. This is for her, and for those she never stopped caring for. It wasn't poetic. It was personal. Several religious scholars pointed out how rare this kind of posthumous gesture was. Usually when popes pass, said one Vatican historian, their legacy is debated in terms of doctrine, reform, and papal encyclicals. Very rarely does it come down to one handwritten letter in a fund with a name that doesn't even belong to a church. This is a different kind of legacy. But maybe the most powerful response came from where Pope Francis might have least expected it, the next generation of clergy. A group of young priests in Colombia held a vigil in his memory and read his letter aloud. Afterward, they began organizing a fundraising campaign inspired by what they called the Bergoglio method, giving quietly, without recognition, but with immense impact. Even Jesse Waters, who reignited the entire conversation, returned to the subject a few nights later. He played a short clip from the initial segment and then added, "I've covered popes, politicians, and billionaires, but this one managed to outgive them all without telling anyone." In the weeks that followed, donations poured into the small community foundation that Maria Elena had been asked to oversee. She declined to give interviews, but she did release one statement through the archdiocese: "My brother lived in silence. He died in peace. And now through this, he speaks again, not with power, but with kindness." It was clear the story had struck a chord, not because a pope had left behind a fortune, but because for once, that fortune wasn't about wealth at all. It was about love, loyalty, and the quiet power of remembering where you came from. The legacy, no golden crown, no royal inheritance, just one letter, one trust, and a legacy that rewrote everything people thought they knew about Pope Francis. While headlines chased numbers and pundits debated motives, Maria Elena didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her tears said more than any press conference ever could. She'd spent her life in the background, never photographed at the Vatican, never given a formal title, never asked for a thing. And in the end, her brother, who carried the weight of the church, the burden of history, and the expectations of 1 billion followers, chose to leave it all not in a monument, not in a statue, but in her hands. Hands that had once wiped his tears, held his face, and written back every time he mailed a letter from Rome. The trust he created wasn't just about money. It was a message. It said, "I saw you. I didn't forget." It said, This is for the times you stayed silent. For the times you gave when no one saw. For the life you lived in my shadow but never resented. It said, thank you. Jesse Waters, whose reporting first brought this to light, didn't sensationalize the end. In his final coverage, he looked straight into the camera and said, this wasn't a twist. This was the truest version of Francis. He didn't leave gold. He left dignity. And that's what made his family cry. As the world moves on, as a new conclave approaches, and the church prepares for another chapter, there's a story still quietly unfolding in Argentina, a story of a small foundation now flooded with donations, of clinics being built, shelters being expanded, and one woman who never sought attention now carrying out her brother's final wishes quietly, faithfully, and without ceremony. In the end, Pope Francis didn't just preach humility. He planned it. He turned every unused check, every ignored benefit, into something lasting, something personal. And when he passed, it wasn't the church that cried first. It was his sister. If a man who gave up everything still found a way to give even more in the end, what does that say about the legacy we choose to leave behind?